Okay, let's go ahead and get started here. Close those doors in the back, and the clock says it's 10:30, so let's get started. This is week 7 of our study of Genesis chapters 1 through 11, the origin of earth and its people. Today our particular topic will be the origin of races and nations, Genesis 9:8 through 11:32. This will finish the portion that I have, but we have 2 more Sundays after today, and I'm, of course, going to expand on some things the last 2 Sundays. There's actually 9 Sundays in this cycle of Sunday school times this time. Normally 8 Sundays in a 2-month period, but 9 this time. So this is not the end, even though we are going to get to the end of chapter 11 today. Before we go any further, let's have a word of prayer, and we'll get started right into this. Father, thank you again, once again, for the opportunity that we have to study your word freely, Lord, and to learn these things that you have put here in your word for us to learn. I pray, Father, that we would be willing to learn your word without any conditions, Lord, that we would be open to the Spirit as he leads and guides us, as he illumines us in our study today, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so today, the origin of races and nations. And what I want to do today is I want to confirm to you that all the present nations and so-called races, we're going to talk about that, are related by descent from Noah. Also, I want to establish the vital significance of Babel, the Tower of Babel, and with the rebellion and the dispersion that took place there, as really a very key event in world history. I don't know if you realize that or not, but it's a very key event in world history. We'll talk about that. And also then to clarify the background of the world's earliest nations and peoples and their relation to the modern world and the future coming kingdom that we, of course, teach about in this church. All right, so let's get to it. Now, what are some racial and national conflicts that have been in the news recently? Somebody want to just shout it out? What have we been witnessing recently? The big thing. Critical race, right? Critical race, okay? I was hoping that somebody would shout that out. Critical race. And Pastor Gary has written some articles on the critical race theory in his Think on These Things articles. You could access that if you would like, and I'm not here to talk about that, but just to get us started as we think about the origin of races and nations. Suffice it to say, some of the most hard to manage problems among mankind are the many racial and national enmities and conflicts that we see happening today. And we've witnessed this. This is nothing new. This is something that's been going on for thousands of years, really. Thousands of years. So nothing new. So that's why the origin of the various races and nations is a significant question, and one for which evolutionists really have no answer. They really have no answer. And the origin of the many different languages also is an even greater mystery to evolutionists. But the Bible can answer all of these questions. I really believe that. And the answer is seen in the events that took place at Babel soon after the flood. Do you realize that Babel took place about 100 years after the flood? So it was pretty recent to the flood. This was surely one of the most profoundly significant events, as I said earlier, in human history. Now, to get us started in chapter 9, let's look at what Bible students call the Noahic covenant and prophecy. So let's turn in our Bibles to Genesis chapter 9, if you would. And we're going to be looking at verses 8 through 29. But the first thing that I want us to look at, of course, we're going to divide this up. We want to look at verses 8 through 17. So follow along as I read these verses from Genesis chapter 9. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you, and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. And I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the waters of the flood. Neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come about when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So that's our passage that we want to talk about first of all. And of course, the covenant that we see here spoken about is what God made with Noah. It was not only for Noah and his descendants, but it was for all the animal kingdom as well. So that's one thing that we observe as we've read through this passage. Another thing that we've read, we observe as we read, is that the promise in verse 11. No, did you see that promise? It would be meaningless if this were a local flood. Now, we talked about, the ridiculousness of a local flood last week. So if you missed it, you can access it on the YouTube, on the Southern View Chapel YouTube, and you can go back and look at that. But the promise that we have here in verse 11 would be meaningless if this was a local flood. Do you see what verse 11 says? And I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood. All flesh. All flesh. There's a clue. Neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. Not just part of the earth, but all the earth. So that promise that he made there would be meaningless if it was a local flood. Another thing that we realize from this passage is that God established his covenant with Noah. Notice. And the sign of the covenant, of course, was the rainbow. Now, I have a picture of a beautiful rainbow here. Now, I used to live in South Dakota. And I don't know if you folks have rainbows here, but we had rainbows a lot in South Dakota. And this is not a picture of one from South Dakota. This is one that I found. But it's very indicative of what it was like. We could just step out our front door in South Dakota where we lived in Hot Springs, and we could see many times a beautiful rainbow, sometimes a double rainbow. Again, God says this is the sign of the covenant. Now, but the question is, what is the rainbow covenant? So let's talk about that. What is the rainbow covenant? Of course, the answer is that God promised to never again destroy the earth with a flood. Now, he didn't promise he's not going to destroy the earth, because we know that the earth is going to be destroyed again, okay? But not with a flood. It's with fire this time, the second time. So that is the rainbow covenant. God promised to never again destroy the earth with a flood. Now, despite the fact that a rather fragile equilibrium exists between land and sea, there is enough water in the ocean to cover a smoothed earth to well over a mile. There has never again, in over 4,000 years, it's been over 4,000 years, there's never been a time when the ocean covered all the land. We know that from Psalm 104, verse 9. Psalm 104, verse 9 sums it up. It says, You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. It's talking about, the water there, the flood. All right, so that is the rainbow covenant. All right, so that's Psalm 104, verse 9. There it is. Now, so that's verses 8 through 17. Let's move on now, and let's read verses 18 through 23. Normally I have, if it would be a smaller class, I would have folks, participate in the reading of Scripture. We can't do that here, but I'll go ahead and read it myself. Verses 18 through 23 of Genesis 9. Going on. Now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. Then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. Okay, so verses 18 through 23. Now, according to Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 14 and 20, and I'm not going to go there, but according to these two verses in Ezekiel 14, Noah was one of the three most righteous men in the ancient world, the others, of course, being Job and Daniel. It says that in that Ezekiel passage. Yet, we see here that even Noah had one serious lapse. He wasn't perfect, okay? Noah was not perfect. He had one serious lapse. That is, he allowed himself to become intoxicated so much that he discarded his garment and fell into a drunken sleep, as we see here in this passage in Genesis chapter 9. So he did that. Noah's sin was serious enough, but the sin of his youngest son Ham was much greater. Do you realize, yes, we're talking about Noah's sin here, but Ham's was even more serious. But the question is, what was Ham's sin? I mean, look, it just says here that there in verse 22, and Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. What's the big deal? Well, that word saw is not what we think it is. What it means is that he looked upon the sin of his father gloatingly. He looked upon it. He dwelled on it. Okay? So we can only speculate what his sin would be, but evidently Ham here was chafed for a long time under the moral rectitude of his father Noah. Again, we're just speculating. And now he was relieved and pleased. He looked with pleasure, you see. He was pleased to see this savory experience, or the savory evidence, I should say, of his father's human fallibility. He now felt free to indulge his long-restrained ambitions. But notice the contrast. Shem and Japheth did not share their brother's attitude, but they did what they could to help their father, Noah. And so Ham's sin, I believe, was rebellion and unbelief, not only against Noah, but also against God. So that was really serious. I mean, it was serious enough for Noah to get drunk like that and to be uncovered like that. But Ham's sin, I believe, was even more serious. So that is the sin of Ham there in verses 18 through 23. Now let's move on to verses 24 through 29 in Genesis 9, and we see here Noah's prophecy. Going on, verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. In other words, what Ham had done. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." And Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. All right, so here we have the prophecy of Noah. And the resulting prophecy that we see here of Noah was uttered partly in recognition of the respective natures of the three brothers. We read about that. the passage we just read here. But under the inspiration of God, I believe, the prophecy also outlined the general course of future history as influenced by their descendants. Okay, the general course of future history as influenced by their descendants. Now, unfortunately, this prophecy has been misunderstood by many to refer to three different races. Okay, to three different races. Now, I'm going to expand on this next week, and I'm going to be talking about the unity of the race. I want to zero in on that thought biblically next week, but just in passing here. This has been misunderstood to believe that it's referring to three different races, but the Bible, you see, folks, does not call them races. Do you see the word race there? I see the word race, but it's referring to the human race, one race. Okay, so the Bible doesn't call them races. Neither the word nor the concept of race, as we know it, as evolutionists have told us, is found anywhere in Scripture. As far as the Bible is concerned, there is only one race. Now, this is a secular view, of course, and of course is steeped in evolution. But as far as the Bible is concerned, there is only one race. And what is that? It's the human race, isn't it? For instance, in Acts chapter 17, if you turn there, if you have it, if you can real quickly, but let me read Acts 17, verse 26. Here we have it. Verse 26 of Acts 17 says, "And he made from one every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their habitation." He made from one. Folks, that's an indication that there aren't several races. There aren't four races or three races or whatever they tell us today. There is just one race. It's the human race. Okay, despite what they tell us, what evolutionists tell us. Race, as popularly understood, is strictly an evolutionary concept. Okay, comes from evolutionism. Evolutionists claim a race supposedly is supposedly a sort of subspecies in the process of evolving into new species. In fact, Charles Darwin, you remember his book? In his famous book, The Origin of Species, he had the subtitle, "The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life." So races, the term races is an evolutionary term. Now, but we know the biblical view, as I've already said, is that there is one race descended from Noah, the three sons of Noah. And we're going to talk more about that as we go along here today. Now, how would a biblical mindset toward race then solve the racial and national conflicts that we talked about earlier? How should it impact our relationships with our neighbors? How should it impact the church's relationship with the surrounding community? And here in this little cartoon, this is kind of, we see this a lot. I've never seen anyone like him before. What race does he belong to? Again, the thinking, that we categorize people into one of four races. And the guy beside him says the same race as you, the human race. And so the variety that we see in people doesn't make us that different. All humans belong to one family. We are one family. We all have the same blood. We all have the same body temperature. We're going to talk more about that next week. All right. So that is Genesis, the last few verses there of Genesis chapter 9. Now let's move on to another subject that I find intriguing. There in Genesis 10, the table of nations. The table of nations. The best information that we have about the origin of the earth's first nations, is found here in Genesis 10 and even in Genesis 11. This is so because it's the only information that is not purely evolutionary, not pure evolutionary speculation. Thus, these records are extremely significant. And the summary verse is in Genesis chapter 10, verse 32, as well as back in chapter 9, verse 19. Let's go back. Let's look at verse 32 there of chapter 10, right, the last verse of the chapter. These are the families of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies by their nations, and out of these the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. And also, if we go back to chapter 9, verse 19, we read these words. These three, in other words, the sons of Noah, these three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. So the table of nations tells us plainly here, these verses, rather, in Genesis tell us plainly that of all the present nations that have been derived, all the present nations have been derived from these, from 70 primeval nations, as stemming originally from the streams of civilization that came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And there we have the graphic there. All human beings, of course, are descended ultimately from Adam, but Noah, of course, was he was from the line of Adam. And, of course, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, all nations on the earth, descended from them as well. So here's the question that we want to ask ourselves. If all the present peoples and nations have derived from Noah's three sons, then how do we explain the physical differences? Many physical differences. How do we explain those physical differences? Well, one thing we can say about that is that all physiological variations in the present world could easily have developed in 4,000 years. Could have easily have developed in 4,000 years from the gene pool in these six people, as originally received through the descent from the created genes in Adam and Eve. As Henry Morris writes in his book, The Genesis Record, and this is what he says, and I quote, "Somehow, by the regular mechanism of genetics, variation, recombination, and all the various groups of nations and tribes must have been developed from this beginning." This is on page 232. It can also be shown that the world's present population, which is approaching 8 billion people, I don't know if you knew that or not, but the world's present population of nearly 8 billion people could easily have developed in 4,000 years from these six, even at the present growth rate of 1.05% annually. I don't know if you remember, but back a couple sessions ago, we talked about the present growth rate of the world is 1.05%. So this could have taken place very easily. The world's population that we have right now, nearly 8 billion, could easily have developed in the 4,000 years, even at the present growth rate of 1.05% annually. Now, the remarkable document that constitutes Genesis chapter 10, which is where we are right now, was probably compiled by Shem. Now, again, this is just speculation, compiled by Shem, who took over the record-keeping responsibilities after Ham and Japheth moved away. To Shem, this may have been simply a family genealogy, but to us, it is also an invaluable record of the earth's first nations. It is called, of course, the Table of Nations. And really, there's nothing quite comparable to it in ancient literature. Many of the names in the Table of Nations listed by Shem, essentially as individual men, soon gave their names to the tribes and nations that they founded. So Shem, we have 26 nations attributed to him, Ham, 30 nations, and Japheth, 14 nations. If you add those up, 26, 30, and 14, I'm confident you would get 70. All right, so many of the names in the table of nations listed here by Shem, essentially as individual men, soon gave their names to the tribes and nations they founded. There is not enough time to talk about all 70 nations. I wish I could, all 70 names here in this table of nations, but we'll discuss a few. I want you to notice that from Genesis chapter 10, verses 2 through 4, that Japheth had 7 sons, but only the grandsons of 2 of his sons are listed, and that's Gomer and Javan. Look at chapter 10, verses 2 through 4. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. And the sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan were Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanium. So, of all those that are mentioned here, only, as I said here, only the grandsons of 2 of his sons are listed. Also, according to Genesis chapter 10, verses, again, there Japheth had 7 sons, but only the grandsons of 2 of his sons are listed. Gomer and Javan. I'm a little behind in my slides here. Also, I want you to notice in chapters 10, verses 6 to 18, we have Ham here. We notice that tells us that Ham had 4 sons, but only the grandsons of 3 of his sons, Cush, Mizraim, and Canaan, are listed. Now, I'm not going to take time to read through that passage, but take my word for it. There in verses 6 through 18, we only have those 3 mentioned. All right, so again, Ham had 4 sons, but only the grandsons of 3 of his sons are listed, Cush, Mizraim, and Canaan. Now, in verses 22 through 24, let's go there now. Here we see that Shem had 5 sons, but only the grandsons of 2 of his sons are listed. Look at verse 22 there of chapter 10, verse 22. The sons of Shem were Elam and Asher and Arpachshad and Lud and Aram. And the sons of Aram were Uz and Hul and Gether and Mash. And Arpachshad became the father of Shelah, and Shelah became the father of Eber. So again, very selective. Even though he had 5 sons, only the grandsons of 2 of his sons, Aram and Arpachshad, are mentioned here in these verses. So there they are, Aram and Arpachshad. Now, the question is, why is the writer being so selective here? Why is he being so selective? I mean, I don't know if you realize that, but that's a natural question. Well, it's not clear why he's selective. I don't think it, it doesn't make it clear to us why he is that way. But perhaps this was all the information that he had. Shem may not have had any more information than this when he compiled his list here that we have in Genesis chapter 10. Again, just speculation. We're not sure why he was so selective. But okay, so not clear because all the information he had was this was all the information that he had when he compiled the list. That's a possibility. Now, but there are 2 significant names that I want us to look at, that I want us to zero in on here today. And that is, of course, Nimrod in verses 8 through 12, and Peleg in chapter 10, verse 25, and also he's mentioned in chapter 11, verses 16 through 19. So these are the 2 most significant names that we see here. Now, Nimrod, of course, was Ham's grandson, and his name meant to rebel. Let's look at verses 8 through 12. Let's just read those verses of chapter 10. Going back to verse 8. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one. It's talking about Nimrod now. He became a mighty one on the earth, He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. And then going on, verse 11, from that land he went forth into Assyria, and built Nineveh, and Rehoboth, Ir, and Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. So here we have some information on Nimrod. He was Ham's grandson. His name meant to rebel. His father Cush gave him that name, possibly because Cush strongly resented the curse that Noah had pronounced on Ham years earlier, that we talked about earlier. I'll say more about Nimrod later. I'm going to save that for later. But again, we have the other name, of course, Peleg, and he was Shem's great-grandson and the great-great-great-grandfather of Abraham. And his name here means division, and I think this name was given to him to commemorate that in his days the earth was divided. And I think that division refers to the linguistic division that occurred at the Tower of Babel, you see. All right, with that said, let's talk about the Tower of Babel now, and we'll go to Genesis 11. Genesis 11. Now, after the flood, the entire world for some time spoke one language. We see that in verse 1 of chapter 11. Now, the whole earth used the same language and the same words. Probably this language, again, just speculation again, but I believe probably this language was either the Hebrew language or some Semitic antecedent much like Hebrew. There's a couple reasons why I believe this could have been Hebrew. First, the names of the antediluvian patriarchs from Adam to Noah and Shem all have distinct meanings in the Hebrew language, which would indicate that the pre-flood language, again, was Hebrew. The second reason why I believe this was Hebrew is that though Noah and Shem were living at the time of Nimrod's rebellion, it's not likely that they would have participated in it. In fact, I'm sure they didn't. They didn't participate in it. Thus, there would have been no reason for God to change their language when he confounded the language of the rebels. So a couple reasons why I believe that this language was probably Hebrew. All right, so let's look at verses 1 through 9 in particular here of Genesis 11. Let me read those for you. Now the whole world, we read verse 1 earlier, but let's read it again. Now the whole world used the same language and the same words, and it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now remember, God had told them to scatter. So they're rebelling against that. That's a key thing here. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they propose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us, okay, the kind of a veiled reference to the Trinity here. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Now, at Babel, of course, we see that their languages were confounded. and each tribal group had to leave and find its own home and make its own way in the world. For some time, depending upon the individual unit, they had to live off the land until the population grew large enough to permit specialization. Until they could find metals suitable for building materials, they had to live in caves or fragile huts. Now, evolutionists like to make a lot about cavemen. And cavemen, yes, men lived in caves, but this is why they lived in caves, because after the flood, they didn't have building materials to build buildings right away. So that's when men were living in caves. In fact, there are men living in caves today. There are men who are apartment men, as this graphic shows us. There are men who are hut men, or igloo men, or teepee men, or castle men, and as well as a caveman. Now this, of course, may not all be true today, but it's been true down through the history of man. So there's no big deal about cavemen here. So until they could find metals suitable for building materials, they had to live in caves or fragile huts. And that's why, apparently, in every part of the world, archaeologists find evidence of a hunting and gathering so-called Stone Age culture. And there was no such thing as a Stone Age, okay? There never was. But so-called Stone Age culture at the oldest level, and then soon after, remains of Bronze and Iron Ages, as well as agriculture, animal husbandry, and urbanization. Some families, that is, from Egypt and Sumer, seem to have developed high civilizations very early, having managed to occupy the most favorable regions and being capable and industrious. Others, the Neanderthals, were pushed out further, and some groups even died out. So, as families scattered, Nimrod was left in Babel. And with his great ability and with his demonic guidance, I believe he was guided by demons, he was able to build the world's first great civilization. And that is what historians and archaeologists call the Sumer Babylonian civilization. He was able to do that and build that into a prototype of all later anti-God religious cultures. Okay? So he built the first great civilization into the prototype of all later anti-God religious cultures. All right. So, although Babylon in later centuries fell under the control of other nations and kings, it was regarded throughout the pre-Christian era as the archenemy of Israel and God's program. Furthermore, the religious system developed at ancient Babylon has been shown by historians of science and culture to have been quickly established, under different names, of course, in every part of the world. The false rationale of all this is some form of evolutionary pantheism at the intellectual level, with idolatrous polytheism, spiritism, and astrology implementing it at the popular level. So Babylon has always been the archenemy of Israel and God's program. And again, Revelation chapter 17, verse 5, and I won't take us there, but Revelation chapter 17, verse 5 says that Babylon is the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. It will apparently be revived in the end times as the great world capital of the Antichrist, as Babylon the Great. And that's what Revelation chapter 18, verse 2 tells us. And that's when God's judgment will finally destroy it forever. Again, that's in the book of Revelation. All right, so this is Babylon. Now, let's move on to 11:10 through 26, and I want to talk a little bit about the dispersion here. Chapter 11, verses 10 through 26. So look at verse 10 there of chapter 11. These are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. So with this account of the dispersion that we have here in the rest of chapter 11, with this account, we believe that Shem terminated his own generations. The clue there is in verse 10. These are the records of the generations of Shem. He concluded his own generations, and Terah, the father of Abram, then took up the task. Terah recorded only the names. Okay, here we have Shem again terminating his own generations. Terah taking up the task. Terah recorded only the names of the patriarchal line from Shem to himself, giving chronological data as well as the genealogy. Now, we could read through this, but let me just summarize it. From this record that we have here in these verses 10 through 26, we observe several things. We observe the steady decline of longevity from 602 years, to about 148 years. 602 years Shem, 148 years for Nahor. All right, so we observe that. Also, we observe that these verses clearly connect Shem to Abraham and ultimately to Messiah. And that's very important to understand. God is now narrowing down his focus to one particular family, that is the family of Abraham. And of course, we know that Abraham became, he was the father of Israel, the father of the nation Israel, and Israel became God's nation. All right. Now, let's jump now to chapter 11, verses 27 to 32. Look at verse 27. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. And Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Ishkah. And Sarai was barren, she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So here, Terah finally concludes his own record, and you notice the clue there in verse 27. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Again, speculation, but I believe everything preceding this up to the last break was written by Terah. And we went over that in our first session of the series here on Genesis 1 through 11. So he concludes his own record here at verse 27. And the final verses that I just read to you of this chapter, I believe, set the stage for God's call of Abraham to leave Ur and go to Canaan. To leave Ur and go to Canaan. So that's the final verses of the chapter here in chapter 11. Now let's bring this to a conclusion, and I want to just say a couple things, some takeaways. Conclusion and application of our passage here this morning. Here's what we learn. God has kept his word that the earth would not experience another worldwide flood. And every time we see the rainbow, it should remind us that God always keeps his word. You know, we can make promises as humans, We make all kinds of promises. But when God makes a promise, he always keeps it. And we see that in Genesis, he promises never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. No one can make and keep a promise like our Creator. We are well-intentioned many times when we make promises, but remember, when God makes a promise, it's a promise. It never fails. Also, I think another thing we need to understand, not only that God has kept his word that the earth would not experience another worldwide flood, but also another takeaway, we must be discerning about causes to support. What do I mean by that? Well, we need to consider whether they have the goal of forming a one-world government that omits God, thus attempting to bring peace and unity to the earth merely through human efforts. That's what Nimrod was trying to do. Okay, that's what he was trying to do. And God, of course, foiled that. And so that brings me to this point. Nimrod and his followers thought they could disregard God without consequences. But you know what? They were wrong. They were very wrong. The shared language that they had trusted in suddenly disappeared. This caused confusion and disunity. You know what? God got his way, didn't he? God got his way in the end. The people dispersed to populate the earth. God had commanded them to do that. They resisted, they sinned, but he got his way. God caused them to disperse. I think we need to evaluate our own lives. We as believers, we can disregard God in our lives many times. So the question we need to ask ourselves, are we disregarding God? Are we trusting in something that we assume will last forever? Are we denying God his will? And just as God had his way with that ancient civilization, God will have his way also with us in the end. All right, thank you. Next week, again, I'm going to expand on the idea of the unity of the race, and that'll be our 8th session next week. Thank you for your presence this morning. You're dismissed.